Hi guys, Charles here. In this video, we'll be moving on to section 3 of chapter 3, supply. In our earlier videos, we were dealing with the demand side of a market comprising households. For this video, we'll be dealing with the supply side, which of course comprises firms. Firms produce goods and services and supply those goods and services onto the market. Now, as discussed earlier, although we have goods market up on the slide there, we are always referring to a single market, a market for a single good or service, not a goods market as a whole. It may therefore be more appropriate to add an S behind markets, so that we know we are talking about firms supplying the various goods markets. We can define supply as the quantities of a good or service that producers are planning to sell during a given period. And recall from our definition of demand that what this implies is that market outcomes can differ from the intentions and plans of firms and households. In other words, just because a farmer produces 2 tons of tomatoes during a given season does not imply that that farmer will sell 2 tons of tomatoes in that season. Again, as is the case with demand, supply should be understood as a flow concept. In other words, the supply in a given market is measured over a period of time, such as a day, a week, a month, a year, etc. Now, in theory, a market is made up of many firms who supply the same good or service. It's therefore important to differentiate between individual supply, that is, the production undertaken by a single firm or a single supplier in the market, and market supply, which is the combined supply of all firms producing a particular good or a given service. Now, as was the case with demand, there are many factors that might influence the level of supply, at the firm level as well as the aggregate market level. We'll focus on 5 in this discussion, and to help guide the discussion, we will use a simple relation, which is P equals TR minus C. And of course, this refers to profit, P being profit, TR being total revenue, and C being cost. In other words, the profit a given firm makes is the difference between the total revenue, and the cost of producing the good and service they are supplying to the market. Now, the first factor that I want to talk about is the price of the good that a given firm is producing. Of course, prices are going to influence the total revenue that a firm is able to generate. Therefore, the higher the price for a given good, holding costs constant, the higher the profit. Therefore, we make the reasonable assumption that the higher is the price of the good that a given firm is producing, the more the producer is willing to supply. Before moving on to the second point, let's just recap the 2 most important decisions that any firm will make: what to produce and how much of it to produce. Now, a firm may have decided to produce product X, but there may be some alternative products that the firm could also produce with the same resources it has available to it. Therefore, it's not just the price of product X, the good that they have decided to buy, that matters. It is also the price of these alternative products. If the price of alternative products goes up, of course, total revenue goes up, and therefore profits goes up. Another important factor influencing the level of supply are the factors of production, specifically the costs of the factors of production. If the costs of the factors of production were to increase, this would lower profits and may in turn reduce the level of supply in a given market. Expected future prices are also important. Remember that firms do not necessarily know exactly at what price their goods will sell for in the market. In fact, the purpose of the market is to determine that price. But nonetheless, when deciding how much to produce, firms have to form some sort of expectation of what those prices will be. Let's say a firm expects a high demand for a given product they're producing. That in turn would mean that they expect their total revenue to go up, and thus their profits to go up. This may well incentivize that firm to produce more, in other words, to increase their supply of the given good. Next is the state of technology. What we mean by this broadly is how factors of production are combined in order to produce goods and services. This concept does not only apply to new capital stock, new machines, etc., but also to processes and just new knowledge of how to combine things in order to develop a given good or service. And the state of technology, if there's progress in technology, it could result in a lowering of the cost of production. This in turn raises profit. So improvements in technology ultimately have the effect of increasing supply. We can now replace these 5 factors with symbols so as to write down an equation for supply. And as was the case with demand, we're going to focus entirely on prices in our analysis. In other words, we're going to hold all the other factors constant, which is what the bars above the symbols indicate. Again, as was the case with demand, we can express supply as a table as well as a graph. In the table, we can simply put down various prices of a given good and the associated quantities supplied at each given price. Now notice, as the price increases from 1 Rand per kilo to 5 Rand per kilo, I guess the example once again is tomatoes in this case, the quantity supplied increases from 500 to 2,500. So this illustrates the idea that as price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. And the same thing holds in the graphical representation. So on the vertical axis, you have the price of tomatoes at rands per kilo. On the horizontal axis, we have the quantities of tomatoes supplied in kilograms. So this is just taking each combination of price and quantity and plotting it on PQS space. If we do that for each combination of price and quantity supplied, we eventually end up with this supply line over here. With this, we can now state the law of supply, which is, all else being equal, the higher is the price of a good, the greater is the quantity supplied. Naturally, market supply depends on the same factors as discussed under individual supply. And of course, there are many other factors that one can think of that might also influence the level of market supply for a given good or service. So as we deal with demand, we can distinguish between movements along a supply curve and shifts of a supply curve. And as you might guess, movements of a supply curve are determined by price. Whenever we observe a price change, we would expect to observe a movement along a supply curve, whereas we would expect to observe a shift of a supply curve if any of the other factors other than price change. Let's take a look at the diagram on the right. So again, we have P on the vertical axis, quantity supplied, which P being price, quantity supplied on the horizontal axis. Well, let's say that initially price is at P1 and quantity supplied is at Q1. Now let's say the price for the product goes up for some reason. Perhaps there's higher demand for the good or service being produced. So price goes up to P2, and we observe an increase in the quantity demanded from Q1 to Q2. In other words, there's a movement along this curve from A to B.